Hello, this is Professor Natalia, and in this video I'm interested in providing you with some key concepts that will help you better understand Cook's chapter Universal Grammar and the Learning and Teaching of Second Languages. In fact, it is not the entire chapter that we want you to read, but rather the beginning of the text, that is the sections called, the very introductory paragraph, and then the subsection called Principles and Parameters Grammar. And that's it pretty much. That's the only section that we are particularly interested in your studying carefully. Then of course you're always invited to read the whole chapter, read the whole of the sections that the chapter includes, but specifically the focus is the very first subsection in it, the one called Principles and Parameters Grammar. Now, before I begin, let me just tell you that this Vivian Cook is a man. So, in case you're ever asked to refer to this content, say in some question on a test, and then you require to refer back to this author's name by means of a pronoun, you should choose he. Okay, so what I'm interested in telling you is that this chapter has been written by Cook, a linguist who works in the field of language acquisition, applied linguistics that is, and refers to the area of knowledge known as government binding. Government binding is, a stage that Chomsky's theory went through. Chomsky is the head, the brains behind this theoretical, knowledge that we are beginning our classes with. He started out calling his, theory generative transformational grammar, which then turned into government unbinding. Government unbinding encompasses the theory on principles and parameters that we capitalize on, a very, very small section of it for our purposes in contrastive grammar. And then this name or this phase turned into the minimalist approach, minimalist here, approach to the study of language. So it is how Chomsky himself, evolved into his, appreciation of language and how language can be explained scientifically, and how his own theory went through different stages that use different labels. So it started out as generative transformational grammar, then turning into government unbinding, and then turning into the minimalist approach to language. Okay, so having said this, I'll get back to this second slide and say that all this presentation that I am, showing you has been based on different sources. The classes that I myself took when I was a student at the School of Languages, and I was a student of linguistics, and my professor was Professor Berrone, Lucrecia Berrone, MA. Then the source itself that you are to study, the very first section in it. Then another source by Liliane Hagemann, 1991. And then another source, Radford's, 2004. All these sources have served me to put this presentation together, the content it has. And then when it comes to the format, I asked two of my student helpers, Axel and Lourdes, to give me a hand, transcribing my notes that I had in written form to this beautiful PowerPoint presentation. So it is they are the responsible ones. It is them that I have to thank for the format of this presentation that I am showing you now. Okay, so then, as it says here, government binding theory is a development of earlier versions of generative grammar, which was, as I said before, initiated by Chomsky in the second half of the last century. For Chomsky, the most fundamental reason for studying language is that language is a mirror of the mind. That is to say, the study of language gives way to an understanding of how the human mind produces and processes language. So he poses three questions. What is the nature of language knowledge? How does this knowledge come about? And how is language knowledge put to use? So when addressing the very first question is that he comes up with the theory of language structure. When addressing the second question is that he comes up with the theory of language acquisition, and then comes the theory of language use in his address of the last question. How is language knowledge put to use? When it comes to the theory of language structure, so when it comes to this question, what is the nature of language knowledge? That is to say, point number one here. He postulates that he takes an internalist, a mentalist approach to language. He, is doing his work at a time when the linguistic field of studies was, particularly in the United States, was of the belief that language was the result of habits, of different sets of stimuli that children were, exposed to, and then by them imitating, by them copying what they were exposed to with these stimuli, eventually they turned out to be speakers of a given language. So it was the behaviorist approach to language that Chomsky rose up against by postulating that knowledge of language, language acquisition cannot just be a matter of copying, of imitating what language behavior is around us. There must be more than simply imitating what linguistic behavior surrounds us, for the acquisition of language goes through very similar stages across children around the world, and it cannot be the case that they are all exposed to the same type of stimuli. Therefore, he postulates that his approach to language is a mentalist one. not a behavioral one. He postulates that language is a cognitive capacity that every human being has, and he wants to know what is it that languages are, can be structurally defined as. That is, what are the defining structural properties of natural languages? This is what he, sets out to conduct research into. In terms of the second question, the one pertaining to children's acquisition, he says that under normal circumstances, through socialization, acquisition of a language happens by children being exposed to the said language that they are acquiring. When it comes to 3, the performance dimension to language, he postulates tenets such as pragmatic competence, such as appropriateness. So this is to say how language and non-language knowledge interact in speech comprehension and production, because when it comes to communication, what we are putting to use is not just our knowledge of language, but also our knowledge of other facets of our being social beings, and our knowledge of how to interact, say, when producing and understanding speech. So this is more the realm of pragmatics, for it is concerned with the role played by non-linguistic information in our competence of language put to use. Okay? But he's not interested in this dimension. He acknowledges it exists, but he focuses more on this question. So he says that the task of developing a theory of language structure, that is to say, the answer to this first question, is prior to the other two, is prior to how children acquire language and how language is put to use. That's why this is the focus of his study. So he poses the questions: what is language? What is it that you know when you know a language? What are the essential defining characteristics of natural languages? Do languages differ from each other in unpredictable ways, or do they all share certain common universal properties? To answer this last question that has been highlighted in yellow, he says, there must be a formulation of detailed descriptions of particular languages, that is to say, detailed grammars, or ought to be formulated in order for us to answer what language is, what is it that a person knows when they know a language, and what the essential defining characteristics of natural languages are. So he says a grammar of a particular language, part there is particular, will comprise a set of rules or principles which specify how to form, how to pronounce, and how to interpret phrases and sentences in the language concerned. So the grammar will be about specifying what is it that makes Spanish Spanish, what is it that makes English English. When it comes to Spanish morphology or English morphology, any language morphology for that matter, its syntax, its phonology, its semantics. So a grammar is a model. A grammar is a systematic description of those rules and principles that make a language be that language. So it is a description of those abilities that native speakers of that language have that explain the language makeup. So when we have compiled detailed grammars of a number of different languages, the second step is to abstract from particular grammars those common, those universal properties that they all share. So once we have done this compilation of the rules and the principles and the workings of different languages, then the second step is to abstract away from these specificities and find what the languages share, what they have in common. That is to say, the study of universal grammar. That is to say, the search for linguistic universals. Those principles that cut across many, many languages and are not specific to one or two in particular. So the linguistic abilities that enable native speakers to speak and understand their language fluently have to do with their competence. The competence they have in their native language, which is different from this dimension of putting the language to use, this performance dimension, which is the actual use of language in concrete situations. He is not interested in this facet, he's interested in the competence aspect to language knowledge. So, human beings have an innate capacity for language, says Chomsky. It is part of their genetic endowment. We are born with this capacity. This is a matrix that we all share because we all belong to the same species, the human species. And this is a matrix that is activated by the environment. So the environment plays a very crucial role because without the environment, we don't get to have this matrix activated. But then the moment it is activated, what Chomsky is interested in is, disentangling what rules, what principles underlie all languages, the part that they all have in common. So competence is the unconscious knowledge of the grammar of our language. So this unconscious knowledge that we have of the language we speak. Everybody has intuitions about what is well formed or not in their own native languages. Intuitions about sentence, intuitions about sentence structure, intuitions about well-formedness in different facets, sentence level, phonetic level, semantic level, morphological level. So a grammar tells us what we need to know in order to be fluent in a language. So a native English speaker will know that the first three possibilities here are grammatical in English. Grammatical meaning possible, are well formed in their language. So you can say, I gave back this card to him, I gave this car back to him, or I gave him back the car. But we cannot say I gave the car to him back, nor can we say I gave back him the car. We as Spanish speakers may have some doubts as to these two being possible or not. In theory, according to what this theoretical postulate establishes, native English speakers will not have a doubt as to these last two variants not being grammatical. That is what the asterisk shows, not possible in English. It shows the asterisk. Let me go back to my idea before. The asterisk shows that these two possibilities are not grammatical, meaning are not possible in the system English. Intuitions here is used in a technical sense. It is the ability that we have as native speakers of a language to make judgments about whether a given sentence is well formed or not, about whether it has a particular structure, an English structure, a structure that is possible in English or in Spanish for that matter, or in any language or not. Let me see. Yeah, I will stop here and continue in a second video.